Hello and welcome back to the Virtual Classroom U.S. History Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is the conclusion of the 1970s, decade of disillusionment. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the rest of our outlines, starting with point number 3, the Ford administration, and again, as always, pay particular attention to those key terms. Let's get going right away. Now, in the aftermath of Watergate, there was a profound political cynicism and disillusionment that swept across our country. People were disgusted by their government. People had extreme distrust of political leaders. And after Nixon resigns, Vice President Gerald Ford took the oath of office to become our next president. Now, please remember though, Ford had only recently been appointed vice president. In fact, he was not Nixon's running mate in '72. Instead, Nixon's running mate, original vice president was Spiro Agnew, who had just recently resigned in disgrace over tax evasion. Yes, both president and vice president had to resign. And so Ford became the first truly unelected president. No one voted for him. He was appointed by Nixon to replace Agnew and then took over when Nixon resigned. So who was Gerald Ford? Now, he actually was born in Nebraska, but he was raised in Michigan. He was an Eagle Scout. He played football as long snapper and center for the University of Michigan, also linebacker. And after taking office, he addressed the country and said, quote, "Our long national nightmare is over." Now, his job, of course, is to restore the faith of the American people in the office of the presidency and in Washington in general. And one of the very first things that Ford does as president is pardon Nixon for any and all crimes he committed while in office. Now, most students hear that and they're outraged by this, and understandably so. In fact, the American public was outraged. And quite honestly, his approval ratings took a nosedive. This only seemed to confirm that the corruption that existed in Washington. How dare this vice president, now president, pardon a criminal? Because again, what Nixon did was wrong. It was criminal. However, let's just put it in perspective. What was his reason? And again, I tend to believe that Ford had good intentions. His intention said was that if we were to put the president on trial post-Watergate, or post-resignation for Watergate, we're going to drag out the Watergate scandal for years in the court system. We're going to continually drag the American people through this process and kind of rub American, drag them through the mud in the international world. And so by pardoning Nixon, you end the controversy, or you end the situation right there. Let's just move on. What he did was wrong. He resigned in disgrace. Let's just get past it. Now, again, it was probably the right decision. Think about the cost of a trial to taxpayers. Think about the, how long it would take. So again, reality, probably a good thing. Practically speaking, at the time, political suicide. And quite honestly, there's very little to say about Ford's presidency other than he pardoned Richard Nixon. Because post-Watergate, our economy began to flounder. That post-war boom we had been experiencing since the 1940s was over. The expense of the Vietnam War, the rise of inflation, and the increase in unemployment all contributed to the economic problems in the 1970s. But 1970s economy was weird. I mean, really weird, as in economists couldn't even define it. What happened in the 1970s defied the laws of economics because we were experiencing a recession, which should lower prices, but instead we were experiencing a recession and hyperinflation. Now, again, some inflation is normal, but we were experiencing drastic hyperinflation while our economy is in a recession. This can't happen because theoretically, when the economy is booming, inflation is going to occur more naturally. Cost of things go up, but you're making more money, no big deal. During a recession, let's think about it right now. We have just minor example, current present day issues. When the cost of a barrel of crude oil goes down drastically, well, that lowers the price at the pump. You pay for gas. That's how things are supposed to work, supply and demand. In this case, though, the recession means people are buying less, which means prices should go down, but we were experiencing hyperinflation, which means people's purchasing power was getting incrementally, exponentially worse. And economists that can't happen, they coined a new term known as stagflation. This becomes kind of the main term of economics from the 1970s. The United States experiences stagflation. Again, a small amount of inflation is normal, but we were having high levels that caused purchasing power to decline even more. You see the cartoon there. Hey, the costs are killing me. Well, don't worry about that, no job. High unemployment rates. And on top of that, we were experiencing also in the 1970s an energy crisis. And this was largely caused by the oil-producing nations of the world known as OPEC. And most of them are in the Middle East, other than Venezuela. But the Middle East were experiencing tremendous amounts of unrest, warfare, civil warfare, war between nations, Israel, Iraq, Iran. And all of this caused the price of gas to skyrocket and for factories that produced oil to be shut down during this time because of the lack of production, which means motorists would spend long lines at the open gas stations. They'd spend an hour in line to get some gas, and it would be rationed and limited because gas stations were running out and closing. And so this is all happening in the Carter administration. During the Ford administration, who took over for Nixon. And so the reality is, come 1976, it's a new election year, and there was a serious challenge to Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination. Again, usually the incumbent gets renominated easily by their party. There was a serious challenge by Ronald Reagan to challenge Ford for the nomination. Now, ultimately, Ford will fend off the challenge. But don't worry, Reagan will be back. On the other hand, Democrats chose an obscure figure that no one ever heard of. In fact, he was a former peanut farmer and then current governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. And again, Jimmy Carter is very much a reaction to the Watergate era. When Carter runs for president, he runs on his outsider status. Notice this is a populist wave. He's a Washington outsider. And Americans yearned for this. They wanted someone who was not, so corrupted by the Washington wheelings and dealings of Washington circles. It was this sort of yearning for a populist candidate. Again, this is cyclical. We talked about it in the past, right? We talked about William Jennings Bryan. We talked about now Jimmy Carter. We're talking about again with Donald Trump. And as a result, by touting that inexperience, you see the slogan there, hello, my name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president. He's a peanut man. And he has this kind of folksy charm that you just like Jimmy Carter. And as a result, he will capitalize on his being an outsider, capitalize on the post-Watergate era feeling of the country, the cynicism of our country and the government, and he promises that he will, quote, I will never tell a lie to the American people. He's a good guy. Bad president, great guy. And as a result, he will tout his Washington inexperience, and this will help him narrowly win the election over the incumbent Gerald Ford. Now, he enters office with folksy charm. In fact, he very famously did not ride in a limousine during his inauguration down Pennsylvania Avenue. Instead, he walked hand in hand with his wife. He would hold fireside chats with the American people on television. He'd always wear a little cardigan sweater. Again, picture Mr. Rogers here. This is what he looked like. Unfortunately, while this was very endearing to the American people, his folksiness soon wore off. And Jimmy Carter, God bless him, God bless his heart, he entered office facing some huge, insurmountable challenges. He was faced with the task of simultaneously reviving the economy and reasserting American as a global power. Think about that. We'd lost the Vietnam War. Our name has been dragged through the mud thanks to Richard Nixon and his resignation in Watergate. Plus, we have stagflation. So he's got to revive the economy, restore America as a global power, and raise our national spirit because Americans are very cynical of their government. And this is a man who's very politically inexperienced, especially in Washington. He's set up to fail. So what does he do? Well, he attempts to deal with the staggering economy by balancing the budget. Wait, during a recession, are you supposed to balance the budget according to Keynesianism? No. But at the same time, he balances the budget, cuts taxes, and increases public works projects. In other words, this is a mishmash of conservative, liberal, not really sure what it is. So public works project to put people back to work because unemployment's high. Okay? Cutting taxes because that stimulates the economy, theoretically, and balance the budget, which, of course, is what caused the Roosevelt recession back in the 30s. Not sure it's going to work very well. And again, the problem here is, how do you cut taxes and increase public spending? You can't. It doesn't work that way. And as a result, by the time he leaves office, inflation's very high at 13% a year. And of course, he gets the blame for a poor economy because he's the president. So what was the reason? Well, again, we already discussed the problem was cost of Vietnam, oil energy crisis. But conservatives began to argue that it was the Great Society programs and the domestic welfare spending that drove up costs that were really what caused our problems in our economy. What about Jimmy Carter, though? Again, he's not really sure what to do here. And again, it's a hard problem because how do you fix this problem? Traditionally, it's Keynesianism, right? You fix a recession by pumping money in the economy. The problem with that is when you do that, government spending, that causes inflation. We already have hyperinflation. That's a problem. It's part of stagflation. So if you pump more money in the economy, you cause even more inflation. So you cut back spending, but that causes a recession. You balance the budget, it causes a recession. It's a cyclical problem you can't get out of. And Jimmy Carter, again, bless his heart, great guy, bad president. The very lack of experience he touted that helped him win the presidency results in I don't know what to do with Congress. All that wheeling and dealing that's needed to get bills passed, he failed miserably at. He hated the wheeling and dealing of Congress. He also didn't know how to do it because he was not a Washington person. He was an outsider. Again, it helped him get elected, but it's bad when you want to try to pass your agenda, especially domestic policy. And then things got worse for Jimmy Carter. Poor Jimmy, bless his heart. You see, the energy crisis continued. It had abated a little bit in about 1976, 1977, but 1979, there was renewed violence in the Middle East. Russia has invaded Afghanistan, and we have another fuel shortage, forcing motorists to wait in again long lines for gas that was outrageously expensive. Again, this was massive layoffs. I mean, I remember my dad. He always remembered 1970. He didn't talk about it much, but when he did, it was with quite a bit of dejection and almost shame. because he worried about feeding his family. It was really the only time he ever experienced that, where he was laid off from General Motors for weeks plus at a time. And it was really a question of not when, but maybe even if he was getting called back to work due to stagflation, due to the energy crisis, oil crisis. And I remember that because, again, I wasn't born until after that, but it was one of the very few times I felt my dad felt vulnerable. So how does Jimmy Carter deal with this? Or how does he fare with this? Well, bad. In fact, during the late 70s, his approval rating was just 26%. Guys, think of this for a minute. 26%. That's lower than Nixon's approval rating during the height of Watergate. Remember, it's the economy, stupid. The economy is so bad under Carter that he has a worse approval rating, 26%, than Nixon did during the height of the Watergate scandal. And he had to resign. Nixon tries. He calls his advisors to Camp David to do a retreat. And he emerges 10 days later proclaiming a, quote, a rebirth for the American spirit, a new and positive energy program. However, Congress largely nibbled his ideas to death. In fact, one person said that it looked like his energy bill he tried to pass, had been nibbled to death by ducks, unquote. So he tried to pass an energy bill to fix some problems, hopefully. He had a plan. But he was so weak at the wheelings and dealings of Washington with Congress that they basically tore it apart, changed it, modified it to the point it wasn't even recognizable. It had been nibbled to death by ducks. And the economy only gets worse under Carter. Unemployment slightly declined, but inflation more than doubled. The end of the malaise was nowhere in sight. Oh, and then things got worse. You see, the Carter presidency ends on a major foreign policy crisis, this time in Iran. You see, the crisis began because the U.S. government had been backing the leader of Iran, who was known as the Shah. And the Shah was not well liked among many of his people in Iran, in large part because he was backed by the West, the United States. And in 1979, at the hands of revolutionaries, led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, he was a Muslim religious leader. The Ayatollah will successfully oust the Shah and replace him and basically send him into exile. And again, he does so because he feels the Shah is too in bed with the United States and the West, that they've lost their way as a Muslim nation, and he wants to restore the Muslim pride to Iran. Now, again, he wants to restore Islamic values and make, Iran great again. So the Shah is sent into exile, which, why does this all matter? Well, the Shah is sent into exile after this coup, this revolution. And in late 1979, it's discovered that he has cancer. And so Carter, again, bless his heart, does the humane thing. He invites the Shah into the United States for treatment. Because we have great doctors, we have great hospitals. Let's treat the Shah as a humanitarian effort. Again, Carter's humanitarian. The result of this, though, is seen by the Ayatollah back in Iran. This is seen as a slap in the face to Iran. And as a result, a frenzied mob stormed the U.S. embassy. And they will take 53 Americans hostage. This becomes known as the Iranian hostage crisis. So this frenzied mob storms the American embassy in Tehran, Iran, seizes the American diplomats and staff, including 53 total hostages. Now, Americans demand a military response. They took our people, let's get them back. This was outrageous in the minds of Americans. But Carter's range of options were actually very limited. Now, The first thing he does, he appeals to the United Nations. That's their job, right? United Nations. And he protests this as a violation of international law. But the Ayatollah says, we don't care. Screw you. And UN is no help. So Carter then does the next best thing, economic diplomacy. He freezes all of Iranian assets in the United States and appeals to the American allies to do the same, to place a trade embargo on Iran. But America's most loyal European allies are reluctant to help us here. Why? Iran's a major oil-producing nation, and they want access to oil during an energy crisis. So remember, it's the economy, stupid. And the energy crisis loomed throughout the world. So as a result, our normal allies that should support us in this refuse to back this embargo. So he's made 2 attempts now and failed. Neither one's really his fault. So he authorizes a risky military attempt to rescue these hostages. And 1980, he sends in American commandos. Unfortunately, the helicopters barely lift off the ground, they malfunction, and will kill 8 of our troops. Now, Carter will escape this, but it looks really bad for him. But the Secretary of State will be forced to resign as a result of this. Again, everything he tries it fails. Again, Jimmy Carter, bless his heart. And what made it worse was the Iranian revolutionaries, the Ayatollah. They would taunt the United States nightly on the evening news. They would post videos of them, beating. You see the picture on the screen of them, holding these hostages and basically taunting us and daring us to do something. They held our American hostages for 444 days, more than a year. And if you want to watch a good movie on this, watch the movie Argo. It's directed by and stars Ben Affleck. Watch the movie. It's a great movie on the Iranian hostage crisis. There's some liberties taken by Hollywood, but it's a good movie overall. Now, the remaining 52 hostages were finally released on January 20th, 1981. Now, I want you to understand this for a minute. This is important. Jimmy Carter, 1980, is running for re-election against, we'll talk about later, Ronald Reagan. And all during the campaign, he is trying to negotiate the release of our 52 hostages. And of course, Reagan is using this as bait to say Carter's weak. And so Carter, on January 20th, 1981, finally secures the remaining release of 52 hostages. So yay. January 20th, 1981 was Inauguration Day for Ronald Reagan. And so while Reagan's going to be strolling down Pennsylvania Avenue in a limousine, sworn in, taking the oath of office, Carter's on the phone, securing the release of our American hostages. Unfortunately, though, he gets no credit for this. Because the way the media portrayed and the way many people saw it was, Iran only released the hostages because they were afraid of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a tough guy, and Jimmy Carter was weak. And so they saw it as a response to Reagan's inauguration. Now he's president, we release the hostages, rather than all the work that Jimmy Carter did. Again, Jimmy Carter, bless his heart. And of course, most Americans saw the hostage crisis as saw it as proof of Carter's negligence, as his weakness, as his failures as commander-in-chief. Now, while the Carter administration floundered, the Republicans were forging a plan to win back the White House, which we'll discuss next time. Before we stop today, though, I do want to leave you with a little more legacy of Jimmy Carter. Again, Jimmy Carter, bless his heart, he was not a good president. He was a good man. He is a good man. He's still alive. And I say that because even after he lost to Reagan in 1980, he will go on to be the best post-president in history. In fact, you know him more not because he was president, but because of a program he helped develop, he still works with, called Habitat for Humanity. Helps build houses for low-income families in poor neighborhoods, rebuild houses. And this is he's also humanitarian. He's traveled throughout the world, even in the last 10 years, to help negotiate treaties, negotiate peace. He is a good man. And one more lasting legacy that I want to leave you with. This picture right here. This is Jimmy Carter's house he lives in to the present day. It's the same house he lived in 1972, 1973, 1976, before he became president. The house is valued at $167,000. Now, I'm sure it might get more than that as far as, oh, it's the president's house, it's worth more for that reason. But its actual appraised value is $167,000 in Georgia. When most presidents have extreme amounts of bodyguards, they have mansions, they make millions of dollars, not Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter's just a good old boy who wanted to do good. And yeah, he struggled with that, but bless his heart, he's a good man who did really well after leaving the Oval Office. Now we'll come back on one of the most important topics we'll discuss all semester, the rise of conservatism. It's a lecture I'm very excited about. But until then, until next time, bye-bye.